Tell us, Professor, what obesity is.
It's really the amount of fat tissue in the body, and it's too much. It's over what we call a cutoff of 30, and that's based on kilograms per meter square. And it's a scientific measure that captures kind of all the metabolic conditions related to excessive fatness in the body.
What are the risks of contracting COVID if you are obese?
If you are obese, first of all, you'll have a significantly greater likelihood of contracting COVID, but more important, you'll have more than double the likelihood of anybody else with COVID of going into a hospital. Essentially 113% more likely to go in a hospital. But worse than that, you'll have almost a 78% greater likelihood of going into an intensive care unit and 50% almost likelihood of dying. People who are obese and catch COVID and test positive for it are really at a much greater risk of death.
And why? Why is that?
A lot of it has to do with the fact that our immune function, for the length of time that we're overweight and obese, the adipose tissue are active, live cells, and they become very inflamed. And that, through all sorts of pathways, reduces our immune function. So with obesity or being overweight, you're carrying around a lot of tissue that are inflamed and affecting your immune response. So, for example, the flu vaccine doesn't work as well if you're overweight or obese. It still provides benefit, but about a third less than if you're normal weight. So, and we know that this coronavirus has those kind of effects, and we're worried a vaccine might not benefit overweight and obese people as much, and we're calling out on vaccine test makers to test the vaccines to look at how they affect overweight, obese, and older individuals, and then prepare ways that they might boost the vaccines to help those individuals. So that's the first and most important thing. Our immune functions are reduced. There are also a lot of other pathways, but the most important is this is a lung disease. Overweight and obese individuals have smaller lung capacity. They're more likely to have sleep apnea and other issues with their lungs. And that means that this disease, which attacks your lungs, really has a bigger effect because you don't have as much lung capacity for breathing. So it causes all these complications. So there's a physical effect through our physiology, and then there's the biological effect through our immune system and all sorts of other functioning. So it's a double whammy from obesity. It's a bigger effect than if you just have diabetes and you're, because obese individuals have also many of those problems, but they have the immune function really hurt by their obesity.
It's a bit arbitrary though, isn't it, Professor? Because I am considered clinically obese because I am half a kilo over what I should weigh. But there are people who are 20 stone overweight, and they are also considered obese.
That is correct. There are two other issues about it. There can be people of Asian, Latin American, African descent who can have a BMI of 25 and have the same negative metabolic conditions of an obese individual in UK or US or any other country with non-Hispanic white Anglos. So the reality is that it is arbitrary. It's really based on the risk factors based on white Caucasians and others from Europe and the US. And that's a very arbitrary definition. And there's a second problem with obesity, which is you can be a weightlifter, very physically active, and have a lot of muscle mass and not much fat tissue, and also be categorized as obese, but not really be obese.
Tell us more about your research into the nutrition transition.
Okay, so my research over the many decades has shown a remarkable set of shifts in the pattern of eating, drinking, and moving across the world. Uh, in the 1900s, even before World War II, we were seeing a transition in the UK, Western Europe, and the US toward more overweight individuals because our technology had reduced our effort at work. We had modernized a lot of the factory jobs and other kinds of activities, and that accelerated significantly after World War II. We modernized agriculture. We increasingly modernized all manufacturing and heavy lifting jobs. We brought in the technology of computers and so on. At the same time, our food supply started shifting. And that shift happened earlier in the US and the UK and Western Europe than in the rest of the world. Japan was similar. And by the 1980s, we were introducing these very highly processed foods with lots of chemicals, lots of additives and smells that were very seductive and would sate us. And we started increasing those in the higher income countries. So this is what happened in the high income countries. Well, in the last 20 to 30 years, earlier in Latin America, now in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, and earlier in the Middle East, we started seeing the same transition. Activity went down and diets really shifted. And so we now have every country in the world with at least 20% overweight and obese in adults. And the adult rates of child obesity are growing. And the fastest growing obesity in the world is now coming from Asia and Africa and the Middle East and Latin America, not from the US, the UK, and others. While we continue to increase weight and increase particularly our waist circumference, it's faster growing in most of these other countries.
And how much are the food companies to blame for this, Professor? Because you talk about sodium, you talk about processed foods, you talk about sugar. A lot of additives, sugar, salt, etc., is almost deliberately put into fast food, and people become addicted to what is the constituents of their fast food.
That's right. These are very palatable, both the fast food that you eat away from home, which has a lot more additives and things in them than you would imagine, as well as the packaged and processed foods that we buy or that we buy and heat up or just buy and eat. So that is true. And those foods are now overwhelmingly growing in low and middle income countries. And yes, the food industry is at fault for two reasons. They have the technology to reduce the sugar and fat and put in healthier grains and reduce the unhealthy saturated fat, but they're not doing it. In fact, they're fight regulations. It took a long time to get the SDIL, the tax on soft drinks and sugary beverages in the UK. And the government really in the UK and in the US and in other countries needs to tax all these ultra-processed foods and beverages and force the industry to start to use the same technology to produce healthier food for us. So yes, the food industry is both fighting us, particularly fighting us when countries across the globe are trying to put in regulations to control the consumption of these ultra-processed foods and reduce that consumption and push toward healthier foods. So the industry is not only selling these, knowing their impact on health, but they're also trying to force governments by lots of different means not to regulate these foods.
Professor Popkin, many thanks to you for joining us here on The Agenda.
My pleasure.